Gracious Heavenly Father, we give thanks this evening for this time, and especially for the opportunity you give to us to study your word and to think through, again, some of these subjects that are touching on the world in which we live. And so, God, we pray for you, the work of the Holy Spirit, that you will help us not only understand better, but think through, again, some of the applications of your truth. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, tonight we're going to talk about something that seems somewhat esoteric and kind of over the moon a little bit, but those of us with young boys in our house, it's always good to think about war and what the Christian view of war and how war is prosecuted, and not only that, but how nations should relate to one another, foreign policy, things of that nature. And of course, the Bible has something to say about everything. And it certainly has something to say about this. So tonight we're going to start in Deuteronomy chapter 20, because as God is establishing the nation of Israel, he gives them laws about how they should go to war. And so let's go ahead and start at verse 10 of Deuteronomy 21, Deuteronomy 21, verse 10. When you go forth to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God has delivered them into your hands, and you have taken them captive, and seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast desire unto her that thou wouldst have her to wife, then thou shalt bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. And after that you shall go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. And it shall be, if you have no delight in her, then you shall let her go where she will, but thou shalt not sell her at all for money. You should not make merchandise of her, because you have humbled her. Amen. Now, it's kind of an interesting little law to have in the moral law, right? When we think about warfare, especially back in these days, one of the things we do think about is the taking of slaves, and the taking of especially female slaves back in these days. And so it's good, obviously, that the Bible is thinking about these things. Now, in 2025, is this a major issue in war? No, I mean, that's isn't a huge issue, right? We don't have, we do have war brides, right? Obviously, one of the members of this church is the descendant of a war bride. Anybody?
I'll take it back. It might be an issue for certain countries.
Certain countries, certain. That's certainly a problem with ISIS and, Al-Qaeda and things like that. They do that, right? They steal women and force them into, sexual slavery and things of that nature. But it's not something that's, we got to worry about the United States getting involved in anytime soon. Anybody know who the daughter of the war bride is here at Bethany? Linda Currance's mom is Scottish. Her dad met her when they during the Second World War, and of course that was very common back in those days. But of course that doesn't really fall under Deuteronomy 21, does it? However, when we look again that the Bible does have something to say about this, when we think about again 2025, right? One of the things we have to ask is, civil government, as we understand it, right? Our federal government, United States, according to Romans 13, right? They are to be a terror unto evil and a praise for those things that are good. And we usually apply that, again, just to kind of internal laws and internal conflicts, however you want to put that. Next week, we're actually going to talk about incarceration and jails and prisons and stuff, and talk a little bit about what the Bible has to say about that. So when we think about the sword, right, normally we think about that, right? We think about, corporal punishment and capital punishment and things of that nature. But also, we need to think, again, that God has given the sword to the nation that they might wage war at times. And so we need to have at least some conception with our own mind about how God would have us to operate in that. Now, when you think about war, right, why do wars happen?
Lots
Lots of reasons, right? Well, what's that?
Greed.
Greed, right? Whether wanting land, wanting oil, wanting fish, wanting grain, wanting all kinds of stuff, right? There's all kinds of reasons that nations go to war. Is greed a good reason for a nation to go to war? Well, no, right? One of the things we believe is that nations are moral beings. So nations can sin just like we can sin. Nations can violate God's law just like we can violate God's law. And one of the ways we know that is because God brings judgment down upon nations, both in the Old and New Testaments. On Sunday morning, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the vision that Daniel has in Daniel chapter 7, where he has the vision of the four kingdoms, right? And the first three kingdoms are, the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then, of course, Rome. Well, what happens to each one of those nations in turn?
They wanted to take over the so-called populated world at that time and expand their empire.
That's right. They wanted to expand their empire. They were successful in it, at least for a season. But do any of those, nations still exist in that sense?
Not really.
No, right? And the reason is because God destroyed them because they broke his commandments, right? They violated his law. So again, God looks at nations as moral beings. And so whether we're talking about internal or external, right, nations as nations should seek to follow the law of God. So, using the United States as an example, when we think about, warfare, and we think about, the kind of things that we've done as a nation, right, are there wars that we have been engaged in that you think would be lawful according to the moral law? Let's try to keep it within the last 40 years. Let's think of wars that have been going on since y'all been alive. All right. What's the first real war that you remember?
3 years ago,
Yeah.
Yeah, for us, it was Persian Gulf.
Right, Persian Gulf, right? See, Korean War, were you old enough for that? I didn't think so. I didn't think you were that old.
No,
Man.
but
Uh-huh. Yeah.
finishing up in Vietnam started.
Right, and Vietnam started, right? So, let's use the first Persian Gulf War as an example, right? What brought about the first Persian Gulf War?
Invasion between, I guess Iraq and Saudi Arabia, yeah. Invaded,
Invading Kuwait, right? Kuwait was the little country there, right?
Yeah.
So you have a nation, Iraq, that invades another nation, right? We understand that invading another nation is a violation of, the moral law, right? Because what would we call that?
Stealing.
It's stealing, right? It's a violation of the 8th commandment, really. Taking land that's not yours. Now, obviously, that's a complicated thing because, how long has the nation of Iraq been around, as a nation? Anybody know the history of that?
They've been around forever, just changing names.
Well, in some sense, that's true.
Yeah.
There's always been people over there.
That probably has probably 100 years, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Iraq was really created after the First World War when the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, and the British and the French kind of took over that area, and then kind of really randomly cut these countries into being. It's one of the reasons why there's so much warfare in the Middle East, because you have these kind of artificial countries that really didn't exist until the 20th century, and so that's why there's so much internal fighting in those countries, because you have all these tribes and these different people groups who don't really belong with each other, but the British put the lines where they were. Now, Saddam Hussein's argument for invading Kuwait was that who did he think Kuwait belonged to? Iraq, right? The people who kind of make up Iraq. Now, again, let's play devil's advocate a little bit, right? if you're Saddam and you're leading your country, and you think that the British stole this land from you and gave it to somebody whom it didn't belong to, all right, would you be right to take it back?
In his eyes, he was.
Right, surely in his eyes. I mean, he's certainly self-justified.
Yeah.
Right.
It's still wrong though.
That's right. It's still wrong, right? Yeah, it's not his, right? It's not Iraq's, right? I mean, you could make that argument for anything, right? I mean, if the Catawba Indians wanted to, come burn all our houses down and say we took the land from them, right? Would that be a lawful use of force? No, right? Yeah. If somebody steals your TV, are you justified in going to their house and slaughtering their family in order to get your TV back? No, right? So, the same principle applies. Now, when we think about our involvement, the United States' involvement in that, all right, we had made an agreement with Kuwait that we would protect them. And, if you make a vow, what does the Bible say you need to do? Fulfill it, right? So, I think we can look at the first Gulf War and make a pretty clear case that was a lawful engagement of United States forces in the protection of a nation. And one of the reasons why we can make that argument is what did George Bush I do after we ran the Iraqis out of Kuwait?
They gave everything back, essentially.
Right? Gave the country back to the Kuwaitis. What else? What did he not do?
We didn't occupy the space.
We didn't occupy, and did we, go to Baghdad?
Decimate Iraq or anything.
Right. There was a very limited objective, right? Limited focus, which is remove the Iraqi army from Kuwait, and when they were gone, right, we pulled out. Right. So that's one of the ways that you see legitimate warfare in, according to a biblical standard, right? One, right, you do what you set out to do, right, which was free the people. And once the people are free, right, do you exploit them? No. Right. Violation not only 8th commandment, but 7th or 6th commandment, right? The other thing to think about when it comes to warfare, especially that kind of warfare, is that one of the things that became kind of a thing. How old? Like, you're 2 years younger than me, so you're what, 8, 9 when that happened? Iraq War, something like that.
I got a pen pal.
That's right. Now, y'all in junior high?
It was a 91.
91?
Yeah. No, we were 9th grade.
9th grade, okay. So you're a little bit older to remember some of that, right? And one of the things, one of the things I remember about that was that, I was big into baseball cards, and you could buy, I don't know if you remember them, but you could buy like Operation Desert Storm baseball cards. I still have a whole bunch of them at the house. And one of the big things that came out of that was the Patriot missile, right? That was one of the new things, right? And one of the things that was cool about the Patriot missile, and was also cool about warfare in 1991, is that we had precision-guided munitions, right? And so what that meant is that, you think back to the Second World War, for example, right? Generally speaking, how did we engage enemy factories and things in the Second World War? Carpet bombing, right? And what do you think the hit rate was for a carpet bomb?
Well, it just destroyed everything in the whole area.
Right. Yeah. And so, what happens when you just destroy everything in a certain area?
Aren't part of the war.
Right. Now, do we necessarily need to pick nits on that?
It depends. I guess it depends to an extent on how hostile.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you shouldn't be bombing people that aren't part of the event. But at the same time, if you look at World War II and some of those countries were hostile as a
right.
whole.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's kind of a fine line there, I think. So
sure.
Love George Patton.
yeah.
What was Patton's famous thing? You know, right? Well, you know his famous thing. You know,
He had lost, didn't he?
is you know the secret, right, is not to die for your country, but to make the other guy die for his country, right? You know there's a sense in which if you're going to engage in warfare, right? One of the goals, and the book of Deuteronomy talks about this. One of the goals of warfare is to make it quick, clean, and clear, right? So you think about again the first desert storm, right? First rock war, right? How long did it last?
100 days.
100 days, right? That was the famous thing back then, right? Now I was glued to CNN back then. I don't know why, and I don't know which one of my children would have been as well, but my mom used to like have to physically pick me up and make me go to school because I would get up at like 6 a.m. and watch CNN until I had to go to school because I was just fascinated by all this stuff. But the idea again is that clear objectives, clear purposes, right? One of the to kind of step back Second World War for a second, right? Would you think the Second World War was one that was a legitimate action for our government to take? Right? I mean, we were attacked.
Yeah.
There was a direct action taken against us, right? And so it's lawful, right? The scriptures are very clear, right? Self-defense is a lawful action for an individual to take. And so using the same kind of logic, right? If it's acceptable for you to defend yourself, right? Is it acceptable for you to defend your nation? Yes, right? So, Second World War could be argued to be a lawful action because we were attacked by the Japanese. Now, obviously, had we been or were we attacked by the Germans?
Not at that point.
Not at that point, but
it was also a kind of an axis thing. They were working together.
Right. And so, how long did it take between Pearl Harbor for us to start losing ships in the Atlantic? Yeah, pretty much instantly, right? That was, I read a biography of Karl Donitz, who was the leader of the Axis Navy. And one of the things he talks about in that book is how angry he was that Hitler, declared war on the United States because he was like, we didn't need to do that. Their fight's Pacific.
Well, the Japanese said the same thing.
Yeah. Yamamoto.
The U.S. wasn't even fighting. Why go start?
We could do all that.
Yeah.
And obviously, America's good at certain things, and right, and what's one of the things we're good at? War, right? And so when we decided to go to war against Japan, right? How involved were we? All in, right? And I'm sure you've seen movies and seen posters and stuff from back then, right? What was one of the kind of the motivating things for people back home, right? Support the war effort, right? So you had victory gardens, you had war bonds, you had ladies donating their hose and what's that?
I said probably like even care packages.
Like care packages, right? Rationing, all that stuff, right? So one of the things the Bible understands again about war is that if a nation is going to engage in it, it can't be a half-hearted measure because war is not good. It's never good to be at war, right? War is a result of sin, right? So you should do everything in your power to make sure war is as short as possible because what happens in war? People die, right? Lots of people get killed, right? So, one of the things that, go back to the Patriot missile and First Gulf War, one of the things that we were criticized for was not going full bore and destroying the Iraqi army and everything, right? Now, George H.W. Bush was very clear that that wasn't our objective, right? Our objective was to remove the Iraqi army from Kuwait. Now, to jump forward 10 years, right? 2001, I was over in Japan. That's one of the weird things about 9/11 is that I wasn't here. I'd experienced it totally different than like most Americans, because, when I would go off base in Japan, it's not like anything changed there. There were still planes flying overhead. There was still commerce going on. Nobody really cared, kind of thing. It was just normal over there. But when I got back here a year later, everybody was telling me about how, like, for a week or 2 weeks, right, it was just silent in the skies, and like they grounded all the planes, and it was just, the feeling in the air was, unique, to put it mildly, right? Now, how long did it take us between 9/11 to get on a war footing, so to speak?
6 months? Was it that long?
I don't think it was even that long, but they started some actions pretty quick. I don't know how long.
Yeah, have you ever seen the movie about the horse guys, the CIA guys who went into northern Afghanistan in like December? I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, it was December when we started sending troops in northern Afghanistan, right? Now, why did we go into Afghanistan?
They were looking for the training camps. And,
Right, yeah, they were looking for training camps.
Leadership and food.
Yeah, leadership and all that stuff, right? We knew enough at that time that's what was
They knew the
involved.
problem
Right.
was.
So, 2 years goes by, and the spring of 2003 comes around. What do we start doing in the spring of 2003? Right, invading Iraq, right? Now, you remember, what was the pretense for our engagement in Iraq? What were the reasonings?
He had missiles and
Right, he had weapons of mass destruction, all that kind of stuff, right? Do you think the possession of those things is a lawful reason to go to war?
because they can be defensive weapons technically.
Right,
That's actually different
in
though
terms-
from
Yeah.
World War II.
I mean, it was because it was who had them.
Right, who had them?
But
Yeah.
But with the Germans, because they weren't actually attacking, right?
Well, they did start attacking.
They
It's
started.
like-
They started attacking.
Yeah, they started submarining our ships and stuff. Oh yeah. Like I said, that's what Carl Donitz was so mad about. He was like, "Why are we doing this? This is just going to draw."
Because the
them
U.S. even still after Pearl Harbor wasn't involved. They weren't going to go into Europe.
Right. Yeah, we were involved in the sense that we were sending.
We were sending supplies, right?
Yeah,
Fuel.
yeah, lend lease and all that kind of stuff. Which, this has nothing to do with anything, but I find stuff like this fascinating. When did Britain send their last payment for World War II to the United States?
A couple years ago.
It was 2006.
Yeah.
was when they finally paid off
Big
their
eye
stuff.
to you
Guess which countries never paid off their World War II debt?
Tyler was taking time.
Oh, Tyler tells me this.
Yeah, Tyler, Germany. He named off like 4. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
he knew about
Yeah, Russia's the big one, right? Yeah, they've never paid us back for obvious reasons. But,
it. This is dinner talk table.
Yes.
So, whether or not, Afghanistan, I think a case can be made that there was a lawful reason, right? Because one of the things that was happening at the time was that, there was a lot of people on TV talking about a connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam, right? That was one of the pretenses for going into Iraq. Now, one of the problems with that was, have we ever discovered an actual link between those two things? No. And so, ultimately, and again, this is me talking, so take it what it's worth. Ultimately, I think what motivated Iraq was George W. Finishing the job that his dad didn't do. And, is vengeance a reason to get in war? No, right? Because who does vengeance belong to? The Lord, right? So, even in our lifetimes, right, we have, kind of 3 major wars, if you want to put it that way, that you can point to, right? We have World War II, which is pretty clear cut, right? That we were involved in that whether we wanted to or not, right? Now, when you think again about aspects of lawful warfare and things of that nature, right? What's the big ethical question that comes out of the Second World War?
Probably the bombing.
Yeah, the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? I mean that was one of the things they did when we first got to Japan. That was the first place they took us, was to Hiroshima. You know, and have you ever seen pictures of the dome? You know, I got to like walk around inside of it and stand next to it, which, you know, I thought related to that, after 9/11, for reasons unknown to me, they put me on the NBC team, the nuclear biological chemical warfare team. In case there was an NBC attack on our base, I was one of the first responders for that, which thankfully that never happened. But what'd you say?
I said, oh, great.
I have a picture of me somewhere in full mop gear. But one of the things they did in that is they showed us how to use a Geiger counter, right? You know, and what's a Geiger counter? Measure radiation, right? So of course, where did they take us to do that?
Take you to a hot spot.
Took us to Hiroshima, right? And you know, and again, I'm not super smart, so we're like, yeah, I'm surprised we didn't get shot. It's a good thing people don't carry firearms in Japan. But we're like walking around outside that dome with Geiger counters, testing out our equipment. And I can only imagine what the Japanese were thinking while we were doing that. It was like one of those things that was like later on, like we're on the bus going back and we all start talking and like start thinking through like what we had just done. And we're like, well,
How good of a job did we do?
well, yeah, as we were using it, guess what was a little bit higher than I was super comfortable with? Yeah, the radiation, right? Yeah. And in 2000, this was in 2001, before, you know, must have been October, November 2001, right? How long had it been since we dropped a bomb there?
60
years.
Yeah. Yeah, 1945, so, you know, 56 years since then, right? And what were we still noticing there?
The high rates.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Japanese told us we were using them wrong, and there was nothing wrong. Those things are pretty dummy proof. All you do is press a button and it tests things. But you know, so you think about, right, those particular events. You know, what's the pro argument for the dropping of the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
End the war.
Yeah, ended the war, right? I mean, that's hard to argue against. I mean, I know some people try to do that. You know, tried to argue.
It probably ended several more years of battle.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm. This is certainly true of my family, and I'm sure it's probably true of your families too. I mean, my granddad and grandpa was sitting off the coast of, you know, Honshu, getting ready to invade, right? And what's the likelihood that I'd be here today if we'd invaded, you know, mainland Japan? I mean, you think about, you know, Okinawa, right? You know, the last major battle of the war. Yeah, you know, we had to literally clear every nook and cranny of that island of Japanese from one end to the other. You know, we lost more men at Okinawa than practically we'd lost in the year before, just in that one battle. And you think about, you know, also what's one of the scenes that you probably have seen from Okinawa that involves civilians? Anybody know the World War II history good enough? Yeah.
Probably civilians that had weapons.
Well, I'm sure they had weapons, but you know, one of the things that was happening was the Japanese government had convinced the women and the children that we would, you know, basically do what Deuteronomy 21 says, that we were going to come and rape and pillage and destroy. And so guess what they did with their children and with themselves? Commit suicide, right? There were mass suicides of women and children throwing themselves off of cliffs because they had been told by their government that we were going to do this, that, and the other. Imagine what the human civilian toll would have been on Honshu if we had invaded. I mean, it's probably hard to even count that high, right? So there's an argument that's made that yes, you know, in a vacuum, launching nuclear bombs at civilian centers is maybe not in keeping with the moral law. But what did you say earlier about war? War is hell, right? I mean, that's Robert E. Lee had a famous statement about that, right? It's good that war is so terrible, or else we would grow fond of it, right? There are times in war, right, where simple moral calculations simply cannot be made, right? You can judge things from 60, 70, 80 years later and say, yeah, we probably shouldn't have dropped nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But if you are Harry Truman in August of 1945, what are the three options on the table at that time for him?
One of them was keep fighting.
Keep fighting, right? Invade the mainland. They had a whole battle plan drawn up for that. In the knowledge that not only are you going to lose 1 million American men, but how many Japanese are going to die in the midst of that? Tenfold, 100-fold, or he could have just.
We have done more damage just bombing.
Oh yeah, well that's that's the thing too.
It's been slower. It's all.
Yeah. When we firebombed Tokyo, we actually killed more civilians than when we dropped the nuclear bomb.
Yeah, I think about that. I mean, there was one bomb, but what's the difference between that and running a month of bombs?
Right.
There's really no.
Right. I mean, the nuclear bomb is just more, no pun intended, flat. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, 4 or 5 months before that, right, we'd firebombed Dresden and killed 100,000 people, right? And so, and that's more of a question that comes into modern times with modern weapons and modern abilities, right? Some of the moral and ethical questions get even more difficult, right? Because could you have killed 1 million men in 1585? I mean, you could have, but how long would you think it would take in a war to kill that many people? Because how do you have to kill them in 1585? One-on-one, right? With swords and arrows, right? There's an argument to be. One of the things that came out of the war between the states is that William Tecumseh Sherman and Phil Sheridan and those guys introduced the concept of what we now call total war, right? Now, I could say this in this room, but William Sherman and Phil Sheridan committed what we would call war crimes, right? Because what did they kind of introduce into warfare?
They burn everybody out on the way through.
Burn civilian homes, kill cattle, destroy things, right? And ultimately, what's the goal of that kind of warfare?
Break the spirit.
Right, break the spirit, take away resources, right? It's as much psychological as it is military, right? Now, do you think there's a place for that kind of warfare in a biblical sense of war? I don't think the Bible allows for innocent civilians to be killed and innocent livestock to be destroyed. One of the laws in the book of Deuteronomy that talks about war is that the Israelites were banned from burning crops and destroying fruit trees when they went to invade a town, right? Or lay siege on a city in Canaan. Now, why would you be banned from burning fruit trees and things like that?
First of all, if you're going to end up taking that land eventually, it probably wouldn't be smart to destroy it.
Right. If you're going to live there, you want to maintain those trees.
And also,
right?
there's people who aren't engaged in the war that are probably affected by that as well.
Right. If you destroy foodstuffs,
You're affecting them.
yeah. You're basically causing famine, right? Which is a violation of the 6th commandment. The other aspect of it that the Bible talks about is that kind of in a literal biological sense, who's involved in the war? The humans, right? Has that tree done anything to deserve destruction?
Right.
No, right? Has that the cattle that's out eating grass and chewing its cud and has no concept of what's happening around it? Has it violated any moral law and deserves judgment? No, right? So there's a sense in which, right, biblical warfare, and again, this is much harder nowadays because of the nature of how we fight war, right? We should do everything we can to limit, kind of non-combat destruction and non-combat, death and things of that nature, right? Because again, when we think about the war that Joshua led in the land, right? What's one of the things Joshua was told to do when he went into the land?
Kill them all.
Kill them all, right? Wipe every single Amalekite off the face of the earth, right? Now, what fancy word would we use to describe that today? Starts with a G.
Yeah, genocide.
Genocide, right? The deliberate taking out of an entire people group, right? No, what were you saying?
Psycho.
Okay. Right. Now,
It's a G, so I didn't
right
say.
now, can we say that God committed genocide in the book of Joshua?
I'm not.
Right. Well, that's a good answer, right? Because again, can God command sin? No, right? So if God commands the Israelites to wipe out the Amalekites, what are we to rest and trust in the knowledge of? God, right? And so when we say, right, vengeance belongs to the Lord, right, we're understanding that God has something against the Amalekites. Now, is it for us to determine whatever that particular situation is? No, right? One of the things about warfare that we have to be wise about and that we have to be careful of is that, we must understand that the people we are fighting against are as much made in the image of God as we are, right? So one of the ways biblically we should engage in warfare is we cannot, kind of dehumanize, right, the people that we're fighting against, right? Now that's a common tactic, right? Why do we do that? Easier to kill people that you don't think are human, right? There's been all kinds of studies on warfare going back thousands of years, right? What do people not like doing? Killing, right? So, this is kind of an interest, and I'm sure Tyler has told you about this. But, where does methamphetamine come from? What's the history of the invention of that drug?
Like from the Vietnam War or something.
Earlier.
Earlier?
Mm-hmm. Later.
I think it's Korea, wasn't it?
Right before.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, the Germans invented methamphetamines because, do you want to rush headlong into a bunch of Soviet machine guns? But what would you do if you're hopped up on meth? Right, so the German scientists developed methamphetamine to give to the German troops on the Eastern Front to motivate them to go forward, especially during the winter, right? Do you like working outside when it's 0 degrees outside?
Keeps you warm.
Still move.
What can you testify about people that are on meth? Do they feel anything?
No.
They'll do anything. They don't.
Physically, mentally, emotionally.
Right, they are all in
There's
to
no
what's
decision making at
right.
all going on.
So, and that's something that's gone on for thousands of years, right? When if you've ever watched any movies of the Vikings, right? What's one of the terms that we use to starts with a B to describe the Vikings? Then their style of attacking. They were berserkers, right? What do you think they would give the Vikings before they would land on? Obviously, they didn't have scientists coming up with new synthetic drugs and things like that. But You know, what do you think they would often give the Vikings before they would land?
Captain.
Coffee.
I think
Yeah.
what would come from that part of the world. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's damp there.
yeah.
You know, what grows in damp ground?
Mushrooms.
Mushrooms, right? So, you know, they would give him, you know, I can never say this word, but psychedelics. They would give psychedelic mushrooms to the Vikings before they would land because, you know, is your brain operating on a rational front?
I don't think about Jackson. I don't think about.
Well, again, you know, I mean, that's part of this whole calculus, right? Because people aren't naturally geared towards this kind of thing, right? So, and it's nothing new about that, right? You know, sometimes we think, you know, people back in the day, they just loved doing all this kind of stuff, right? Well, they didn't. So the government had to come up with ways to basically force people to get engaged in this kind of stuff, right? Now, you know, that's a good thing, right? Because what does that tell you about, even though we're all sinners and the world's fallen and all that, what does that still tell you about the moral law that's going on inside a person? You know, there's still a conscience there, right? And, you know, so one of the ways, again, that a lawful warfare should be engaged in is, you know, not kind of coming up with, you know, either medical or otherwise ways to confuse those engaged in combat about what's going on, right? It's not just because we have, developed new psychological diagnoses that we have a lot of PTSD and that kind of stuff, right? You know, that's always been a problem with soldiers returning back from the battlefield, right? You know, anybody know what they called that back in World War I? Shell shock, right? Now, why do you think they called it shell shock back in World War I?
Because they got it when they got shelled all the time.
Right, because World War I, right? Class World War I, you're sitting in a trench, right? And they're just lobbing artillery shells back and forth, right? So you're down inside this hole. And what is constant all day long?
The roaring and the booms.
The roaring and the booms, right? So people would literally go crazy, and they call it shell shock, right? Because that's, again, 1-to-1, right? Now, you know, that's a real thing, right? So one of the aspects of a lawful war is understanding that there's going to be consequences with those who return back from war. So what should a godly commonwealth do for veterans and people who return back from war?
Provide care and
Right? Provide assistance, real care, right? You know, one of the largest departments in the U.S. government should be what? The VA, right? But what do we know about the VA right now? Well, I know a lot about the VA.
it's not very good.
No,
Not
right.
very good.
No.
I know my manager came back from
Uh-huh.
Iraq, and I think he said they kept him at some fort or whatever for about a week, and just kind of checked on him
Yeah.
for like that 1 week, and then sent him on his way.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that we learned from Vietnam, right? You know, I mean, Fred will tell you this, right? When guys got out of Vietnam, how much time would go between them physically leaving the jungle and getting home?
Not much.
Plane ride.
24 hours, however long it took to get from Saigon to Clover, right? You know, what do you think that does to your sense of things? I mean, if you've had zero time to
There's
decompress.
still people walking around with problems from that one.
Absolutely, right? You know, and a lot of it was because not only, should we have been engaged in that to begin with?
Probably not.
Probably not, right? You know, and not only, how did we treat, the guys coming back as a nation?
They were treated pretty bad.
Yeah, awful, right? You know, and I think one of the reasons why in Desert Storm there was this stuff like the baseball cards and, the huge kind of like patriotic events and stuff is because, what did we as a nation kind of have coming into the first Gulf War? We had collective guilt about not just the war itself, but how we treated the veterans when they came home. So we kind of compensated for it by, I had a T-shirt, and all that kind of stuff.
I had a pen pal.
What's that?
I had a pen pal.
Where were they?
I don't know, somewhere in the storm,
Oh,
and he would send me like bracelets.
So like an
from
adult?
Spoons and like other medals
Oh,
and
okay.
stuff. It's pretty cool, but
Yeah. I don't
yeah.
know. That is kind of cool.
Tight.
Yeah. So again, yeah. One day some random dude's gonna show up in your front porch and it's gonna be Carlos Pen Pal. I finally found you. But so when you talk about stuff, right, about just war and how nations conduct war, right? There's a lot that goes into that a godly nation would think about, right? Because would we engage in war very often if we followed kind of the biblical standards for these things? No, right? I mean, that kind of goes, and we're going to close in a second, but I mean, that kind of goes into foreign policy stuff too, right? One of the things that we're known for as a nation, especially in the post-Second World War stuff, is that, what do we have our fingers in?
Think about the police force of the world.
Yeah, we got our fingers in everything, right? So, has that always been a good thing?
Nope.
Right? So I mean, there's consequences, again, to being outside the responsibilities that we have as a nation, right? So again, it's something that we as Christians should think about, right? It's something we should, contemplate on and pray about and encourage our nation to do. I know I already said I'll close, but I have to say it at least twice. But one of the things is, and again, this is just me talking, so take it for what it's worth, but one of the things that kind of grosses me out, I guess to put it the right way, is, like it bothers me. Well, like symbols gross me out, like actual gross things don't gross me out. One of the things is, I'm sure you've seen like some of the ICE raids and stuff that are going on, and it bothers me how, I don't know, a lack of seriousness, I guess would be the right way to say it, but kind of the joy that some of our politicians take in that, right? There's a lack of seriousness, a lack of judiciousness, a lack of solemnness in some of that stuff, right? And we see it going on, not just kind of border stuff, but also warfare stuff, right? One of the things that happened at the very beginning of the war between the states is that there was this idea that we were going to go on this grand journey and we were going to go to Manassas and we're going to fight this battle and everything's going to be over and let's bring our picnic baskets and stuff like that. And what did they discover very fast? Yeah, that's not how things work, right? We have to be very serious about these stuff because it involves human beings, right? Either on our side or the other side, right? And so, again, it's important for Christians, again, to take that kind of stuff seriously because, we better do it well, and we better do it fast, and we better get the job done. Because if you don't, then you end up in a slog in a, World War I situation where you're just grinding human beings up, and things like that. So we'll close there. But any questions, thoughts, comments on all that?
So was 9/11 after that just revenge? Was that wrong for us? Was that just revenge?
Well, I think there were certain things we did. I think Iraq was, certainly in the category of things we probably should not have been engaged in. But I think, there's lots of good arguments to make for Afghanistan, right? Because, where were all those guys trained? In those camps in Afghanistan, right? So, once we destroyed the infrastructure and destroyed the camps and killed all the leaders of Al-Qaeda, what probably should we have done? Right, because, what's our success rate with nation building?
It doesn't work.
Right.
Especially places that don't want to be built.
Right.
So,
and
It was hard one.
yeah. Yeah, well, that's the thing, you know. Now they have all of our stuff because we couldn't figure out how to get out of there for 20 years.
Well, we just built a whole new enemy.
Yeah.
They just, because countries like that, they're not interested in our ways.
Right.
So they're
You,
just gonna,
what was Afghanistan like 4,000 years ago?
yeah, I mean,
It's not so much different than it is.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of what it is now,
tribes
right?
that fought then.
Yeah.
So,
So,
they're still fighting.
yeah.
And
Are we going to magically turn them into Westerners in 6
they
months?
don't want our way. They're not going to have our way.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
let their hands walk away.
That's right. All right. Well, we'll stop there.